this video, we're going to look at how plants respond to the environment, and it's actually a nice quick chapter. It's only 11 marks and it is found in paper 1. I know a lot of you have had bad experiences with plants, especially looking back at the grade 11 chapters that you had to study, but this is actually quite a fun little chapter and it can get interesting. So let's look at what you need to know. The 3 hormones, auxins, gibberellins, and abscisic acid. Then we need to know how these hormones are used to control weed. We are going to look at geotropism and phototropism, specifically the relationship they have with auxins. And then we're going to look at how plants defend themselves using chemicals and structures such as thorns. Now, plants also need to respond to the environment just like humans do, and they also use hormones. The only thing here is that their hormones take much longer to react. Now, plant hormones act in the same areas where they are produced. So this is different to human hormones because human hormones are secreted in one area generally and then they go act in another. Think of TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone that is secreted in the brain and then it goes to the thyroid. So plants, they don't do that. Their hormones are secreted in the same area where they are going to function. So like I said, the 3 hormones we need to know, auxins, gibberellins or gibberellins, and then abscisic acid. Now getting into auxins, where are they produced? They are produced in the apical meristem of stems. Now what is that and where is it? So if you look at the top of a plant, the growing tip of a plant, this area over here, and if we look at it a bit in a bit more detail, the apical meristem is this top part, and that is where growth of the plant takes place, so it growing up as well. Now small amounts of auxins are also produced in the roots, the root apical meristem, which sits over there, and just below it, the tip of the root will be the root cap, and that is just the serves as protection for the apical meristem. So you'll also find auxins in this area. Now, looking at this green part here, it will make a bit more sense a bit later on, but with stems, a high auxin concentration will promote growth, whereas in roots, auxins have a different effect. A high concentration of auxins will actually inhibit growth in that region. Okay, now the functions of auxins, what do? They stimulate cell elongation, so the growth of the plant. They stimulate the development of fruit. They control abscission of leaves and fruit. So abscission is when you would see dead leaves falling from the tree or ripe fruit falling off. So eventually, because of this hormone, the plant won't support the weight of the dead leaf or the ripe fruit, and then it will drop to the ground. It will inhibit growth of lateral branches, and this is called apical dominance. So what does that mean? If we look at this plant here on the right, lateral branches would be branches growing to the side. Now this is still a small plant, but this does not happen as long as we have that apical meristem at the top with the auxins being produced there. Then this plant won't get much wider than it is now. It will just get taller. But if you remove that by cutting off that area, the auxins won't have an effect on that anymore, and you'll see that this plant will start spreading out to the sides. It will become broader, and that is how hedges are made as well. So you cut the top part off, and then you'll see this expansion to the sides. It also stimulates the development of adventitious roots in stem cuttings, and it will cause tropism in stems and roots. Now we are going to look at that now. So what is tropism or tropic movement? It is the growth movement of a plant in response to a stimulus. So what is a stimulus that we learned with humans? Touch, smell, sound, sight, all of those are stimuli. So what would stimulate a plant to grow in a certain direction? Now, plants will grow specifically into the direction of where the stimulus came from. So when it grows to the stimulus, we call it a positively phototropic, as we'll look at now, or geotropic, and if it grows away, it will be negative. Okay, so let's look at the first one. Now, there's actually quite a few different types of tropism, and we are specifically going to look at phototropism, which is light, and then geotropism, which has to do with gravity. Now, there are a few others: chemotropism, which is a response to particular substances; hydrotropism, water, so a response to water. Then there's traumatropism, which is, for example, after the plant has been injured or there's lesions, how it heals itself. So looking at this first one, phototropism, photo means light. Okay, so in this case, there's going to be a growth movement of a plant that is responding to a unilateral light source. What does this word mean? Uni means one, and then lateral means from the direction the light will be coming in. So there's a light source coming from one direction only, and not from all sides. So it's only from one direction. And this plant will then grow towards that light. So when the stems and leaves grow towards the light because they want the maximum amount of light exposure for photosynthesis, they will be positively phototropic. Why? Because there's a growth towards the stimulus, so it is positive. Now, how does this work? So auxins, the hormones we just discussed at the top, are light sensitive, and they move to the opposite side of light. Let me quickly do a quick drawing. So let's say you've got a light source coming in from the side. So for example, the sun's rays. If you have a plant, so here's the plant, a little nice flower growing, and then auxins will be, that's a big brush size. Auxins will accumulate. Let me just do it. Let me just use this plant. I don't know why I drew one. So auxins will be accumulating on the one side of the plant because now light is coming from this side. They do not like light, so they move as far away from it as possible. Now when this happens, they accumulate on the shaded side, and then cell elongation is stimulated, so growth of the plant. The shaded side will grow faster because that is where all the auxins are. And then the stem will curve in the direction of the light, so it is positively phototropic. If what I just read confused you, let's quickly look at these diagrams. So on this diagram, this is now the tip of the plant, so the stem, where the apical meristem is, where you will also find the auxins. So the auxins are all of these little pink dots you see here. Now when there's a stimulus from one direction, so from the top for example, the light will be spread evenly and the auxins won't move to either side and the plant will just grow straight up. But if there's a specific direction that the light will be coming from, let's say from the side, the auxins do not like that, so they will move to the opposite side, the shaded side. And because the auxins promote cell elongation, because there's now such a high concentration on this side, the plant will start to grow only on this side. It will grow here, but it's a bit slower than on this side. And then this growth will actually push the plant over into the direction of where the light is coming from. So positively phototropic. Just looking at this one again, so when there's light just coming from the top, there's an equal spread of the auxins, so the plant will just grow straight up. When the light starts to move to the side, you'll see that the auxins will move to the opposite side of where the light is coming from because they do not like the light, and then they start cell elongation on that side of the plant, and then you'll find that the plant starts to bend and grows towards the light. There's actually a few experiments that they've also done, and they've asked them in previous papers as well, using, for example, this diagram here. So they'll give you a control where nothing has been done to the plant, and there'll be a light source. Then there'll be a plant where they've removed this apical meristem, so the area where these auxins occur. Then they have one where the tip is covered, so no light can pass through that tip that has been covered. Then they cover another tip, but in this case the cap is transparent, so light can still pass through. And there's one where they covered the base of the plant, so no light can come in at the base. And the reason they do this is to see what actually is involved in the growth of the plant. So with the control where there's nothing covered, we know the answer, it will grow towards the light source. Where the tip has been removed, there will be growth in no way or no area, because the growth point has been removed where the auxins are that are there for cell elongation. So this plant will just stay the same. The one where the tip has been covered, so there's no way of the light reaching that apical meristem, which means the auxins will not be stimulated, so there will be no growth towards the light source. With the one where the cap is transparent, the light can still pass through, so it will grow towards the light source. And then where the base is covered, it has got nothing to do with the apical meristem or the auxins, so the auxins will still be triggered, and then growth will happen towards the light source. So in this case, stems are actually stimulated by auxins to grow, and now we will see what happens in roots. Geotropism, so this one is a growth movement of a plant in the direction, once again, of a unilateral gravitational stimulus. So in this case, we are working with gravity. Now, how does this work? So auxins will gather on the lower side of a root. So here we are going to look at roots and stems. They work in on both here. So auxins gather on the lower side of a root due to gravity. I'm just going to go down so we can look at this diagram over here. Okay, we are going to look at this diagram over here. Now this is the root. So when there is gravity involved, the auxins will all be pulled down due to gravity, and they will accumulate at the lower part of the root. So there will be a higher auxin concentration on the lower side of the root, and this will inhibit cell elongation. So if we go back to where we looked at this little piece of information here, in stems a high auxin concentration will promote stem growth, cannot speak, and then roots, a high auxin concentration will inhibit the growth of the root. So the cells on the upper side have less auxins and will thus grow faster, because here they are stopping all growth, but these ones over here will still be able to grow. So roots are then positively geotropic, because they will then grow towards the stimulus of gravity. So these cells will then start elongating, and it will push the root downwards, which makes it positively geotropic. Now with stems, it's a bit of a different situation. So auxins will gather on the lower side of the stem due to gravity. So if we look at this diagram over here, you have the stem, and there's a big concentration of auxins over here due to gravity, and then a higher concentration on the lower side will stimulate cell elongation. So other than the root one where it stops the elongation, here it's going to stimulate it, and then it's going to push the growth of the plant away from gravity. So the plant is going to start growing up. The stem curves upwards and it's growing away, so it is negatively geotropic. So this is what would happen if you have a plant, a pot plant, that is fallen over and you don't pick it up for a very long time. You'll start to see that the stem of this plant will grow upwards, and then the roots, if they are for some reason exposed here, they can even start growing out and downwards. Now there's also an experiment you need to know, and it's using a clinostat, and it's this little contraption here. So basically what happens is this pot plant is positioned on a wheel-like structure that will turn the whole time. And the thought process behind that is so that the plant doesn't become aware of where gravity is, because it's moving the whole time. And then a plant that would not be on this rotational wheel would not be affected as that, and it would actually start growing up and be negatively geotropic. So I'll quickly show you a video on that, and hopefully it'll become a bit more clear. So see how the wheel rotates, and that is just so that there's no gravitational force on the plant, and then the plants that are stagnant will start growing up because the auxins will be triggered there. But these ones, they'll just continue growing straight. Okay, now we're going on to the next hormone, which is Gibberellins or Gibberellins. It is produced in the terminal buds of stems and roots in young leaves and embryos. And the function here is to stimulate root growth, stem elongation, it promotes flowering, and it promotes growth of lateral buds, and then the germination of seeds as well. Then abscisic acid. So abscisic acid is a growth inhibitor, so it works against the auxins. It helps plants under stressful conditions, and it is produced in the leaves, stems, and then unripe fruit. So the function here is in winter for dormancy of terminal and lateral buds. So plants can't keep themselves warm, so they need hormones to control when they are going to grow and when it's going to be best for them. The dormancy of seeds, so germination does not take place when abscisic acid is present. It promotes the abscission of leaves, and then it also promotes the closing of the stoma. Now, how are plants or hormones of plants used in weed control? So in this case, we are just going to look at auxins. So weed killers contain auxins that stimulate growth in dicots, and then narrow-leaved monocots such as wheat, corn, and oats. Now what this does is the weeds, because of these auxins, start to grow so fast, they cannot keep up with the water absorption and food production, and that makes them too weak, and then they die. And this is just because of those auxins that make them grow so fast they just cannot keep up with the pace of growing and absorbing water and nutrients. Then the last bit, we are going to look at plant defense mechanisms. So plants need to protect themselves from insects, herbivores, and microorganisms, and they do this by using mechanical and chemical defenses. So we are going to look at each one of these. So the mechanical defense mechanism, this is straightforward. Plants have multiple layers protecting the inside of the plants, such as bark, down here, waxy cuticle, or even such as coconuts, that the multiple layers that need to get through before you can actually get to the coconut flesh there. Then some plants and trees also have thorns or spines. So this is a spine, this is acacia tree, very dangerous thorns. Those things can go straight through a shoe and your foot. And then, yeah, just a different diagram here showing what a thorn looks like, what spines look like, what prickles look like, and then some plants even have bristles. So these structures would generally be for protecting a plant against herbivores that would be eating from it. And then just a little bit of interesting information, a thorn is actually a modified stem, and a spine is actually a modified leaf. Chemical defense mechanism, this is where it gets interesting. I don't know if any of you, it's a bit of an older movie, or late 2000s, The Happening with Mark Wahlberg and Zooey Deschanel. So in there, the plants take over the world basically. They're sick and tired of humans messing with them, and they start waging a chemical warfare. So chemicals are secondary metabolites, and they are used either in a toxic influence, or so it becomes poisonous, or it influences the digestibility of a plant. Now, the chemical defenses here include some chemicals such as tannins. So tannins are what people use to tan leather. It gives wine that bitter taste. Lignin and silica. And what these chemicals specifically do is they disrupt the endocrine function, so the hormone functions of the animals that are eating them. So tannins are bitter, and they disrupt the digestion and absorption of proteins, and then lignin and silica are undigestible, and they wear down the mandibles of insects. Then there's also alkaloids, which influence the metabolism and the conduction of nerve impulses, and then terpenoids, which destroy red blood cells. Now, some plants are really toxic, and if it can even kill an animal. I neglected to add this picture, so let me see. So I'm sure most of you have heard of a gnawboom or a common tree euphorbia, which is this plant over here. You generally get them in the Limpopo area, but this is actually quite a dangerous plant if you're playing with the sap that is secreted. So it secretes like a milky latex, and if that gets into your eyes, it can be quite damaging, so it can even cause blindness. But the koi san, what they would do is they would cut these branches off, and they would poke a lot of holes in them, and they'd throw those branches into water. And what that would do is it would affect the oxygen in some way. I'm not quite sure how it actually works, but then the fish, it would affect the fish's gills. So the fish, it would inhibit, I would expect somehow how the fish get oxygen out of the water by using their gills, and those fish would actually float to the top, and they take the fish out, remove the gills, and then the fish would be safe to eat. So plants can also be useful, but you need to be careful. And these were actually also used, the latex that was secreted by these plants can also be used to poison the tips of arrows when they were hunting as well. Then just a few interesting things. You don't need to know this. This is purely just because I like knowing about it. So some of the acacias actually have ants that have a mutualistic relationship with them. So in the acacia thorns, these ants actually live, and it provides shelter for them, and then the acacia trees provide nectar for food. But in return, the acacia is then protected when herbivores come to eat from the leaves, and these ants will come out and they'll irritate the herbivores by getting into their noses and so on. And there's a paper, I'll put a link in the description tab at the bottom, an interesting paper of how these ants actually know the difference between wind blowing the tree's leaves and when to come out, and when there's a herbivore based on the type of vibration, and then they'll come out and attack. And then giraffes, quite an interesting thing with how giraffes feed based off of these tannins that we were speaking of earlier. So when trees are close to each other, they can actually pick up when another tree is in distress, because they pick up on those chemicals being secreted, such as tannins, when a tree is being browsed from. And that secretion is then carried with the wind to the next tree, and that tree will know to start producing tannins in preparation for if that herbivore comes, because they don't want to eat too much of that. So giraffe have actually adapted, and they feed against the wind. So if the wind is blowing this way, they feed that way. so that by the time these tannins get to the trees over here, they've already eaten from them and it doesn't affect the taste of their leaves. And that is the end of this chapter. I hope you enjoyed it.